Chapter 1. The Colonial Mind. Unpacking the Legacy of Oppression in Mental Health. Exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience. It is the unhealable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home. Its essential sadness can never be surmounted. And while it is true that literature and history contain heroic, romantic, glorious, even triumphant episodes in an exile's life, these are no more than efforts meant to overcome the crippling sorrow of estrangement. Edward Said, Reflections on Exile. Decolonisation is more than an academic discourse or political aspiration. It is the radical act of remembering what was buried, recovering what was distorted, and restoring what was deliberately denied. It is the process of tending to the wounds of exile, displacement, and cultural erasure. It is a reclamation of identity, spirit, and memory. Colonisation was never solely about territory. It was equally about the colonisation of the mind. The imposition of foreign systems of governance was accompanied by the implantation of foreign systems of thought, seeking to reconfigure how individuals perceive themselves, their communities, and the world around them. This mental occupation continues to haunt us. It lingers in the foundational assumptions of psychology, psychiatry, and therapeutic practice. Today's global mental health systems are still structured by Eurocentric epistemologies, ways of knowing that marginalise, distort, or pathologise the worldviews of colonised peoples. To begin any trauma-informed journey through psychotherapy, one must first confront this historical legacy. For how we can foster genuine healing without first identifying the root of the harm. Decolonisation does not end with dismantling. It requires a simultaneous act of remembrance and renewal. It asks us to hold oppressive systems accountable while also holding ourselves accountable to the stories, traditions and lifeways that colonialism tried to erase but could never fully extinguish. These remnants are not just ruins, they are seeds, waiting for conditions in which they can grow again. In psychotherapy, decolonisation begins with recognising that many of the tools we use, diagnostic systems, therapeutic techniques, even the structure of the therapy room, were developed within Western cultural and philosophical traditions that exclude vast portions of the human experience. These models, often exported globally as neutral or universal, in fact reflect the concerns, values and priorities of white, individualistic, industrialised societies. What becomes pathologised in one culture may be sacred in another. What is labelled disorder may elsewhere be understood as relational disconnection, spiritual crisis, or ancestral calling. Thus, radical unlearning is essential. Decolonising psychotherapy means peeling back the layers of Eurocentric bias embedded in everything from psychometric instruments to cognitive behavioural protocols. It does not necessarily mean rejecting Western psychology in its entirety, but recontextualising it, decentering it as the default authority and creating space for Indigenous, African, Middle Eastern, Asian and diasporic psychologies to stand as co-equals. A useful metaphor is that of rewilding, restoring a forest to its natural unmanicured state so that diversity can return. Likewise, decolonised psychotherapy seeks to rewild the psychological landscape, to create room for multiplicity, contradiction and cultural specificity. It acknowledges that no single model or tradition can claim universality, and that healing often lies in the spaces where different systems meet and are held in respectful dialogue. This pluralistic ethos resonates strongly with the pluralistic approach developed by John MacLeod and Mick Cooper, 2012, which this book returns to in Chapter 7. Their framework emphasises collaboration, client agency, and methodological flexibility, values that align closely with decolonised ethics, though the two are not synonymous. Psychiatry's historical entanglement with colonialism deserves particular scrutiny. In many colonial contexts, psychiatry was not a healing science but a mechanism of control, used to pathologise resistance, enforce obedience and erase cultural expression. Frantz Fanon the revolutionary psychiatrist and anti-colonial thinker, explored this dynamic in The Wretched of the Earth, 1963. He argued that colonial psychiatry treated the colonised as inherently deficient, morally, intellectually and emotionally, and that psychiatric institutions in colonised nations became instruments of subjugation. In French-occupied Algeria, for example, psychiatric hospitals served as holding centres for those deemed politically disruptive or psychologically deviant, categories often indistinguishable in the eyes of the colonisers. Spiritual practices, communal rituals and ancestral healing systems were dismissed as superstition, witchcraft or madness. Indigenous peoples were alienated not only from their land but from their cosmologies and healing traditions, cut off from the languages and lineages that once anchored their sense of self and well-being. These ruptures were not incidental. They were central to the colonial project. They continue to echo in the ways that mainstream psychology too often dismisses non-Western idioms of distress and culturally grounded coping strategies. Western psychiatry as a gatekeeper of healing. Today, the dominance of Western diagnostic frameworks, such as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, and the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, continue to shape global mental health practice. These manuals, though significant in standardising psychiatric care, often carry the unacknowledged legacies of colonial epistemologies. They are not neutral tools, they are rooted in a particular worldview, one that prioritises individualism, pathology, and biomedical objectivity, often at the expense of cultural meaning and collective context. Behaviours that may be interpreted as spiritual devotion, ancestral connection, or communal mourning in one culture are too often pathologised under these diagnostic systems. Ecstatic ritual becomes mania, prolonged grief becomes major depression. Dreams of departed ancestors are deemed hallucinations. In their pursuit of scientific legitimacy, these frameworks flatten the nuanced textures of human experience into rigid taxonomies. This is not simply a technical problem, it is a deeply ethical one. Who decides what constitutes illness, and on whose terms is recovery defined? After centuries of brutal colonisation, genocide, cultural erasure and forced assimilation, Western governments and institutions now extend their power by prescribing the frameworks through which colonised people must pursue healing. The violence of colonialism continues through this clinical paternalism. Colonised nations are told not only how they were broken, but how they must mend. Unless healing aligns with Western psychiatric standards, it is often dismissed or excluded. This shift from territorial domination to psychological governance reveals the deeper function of mental health systems in post-colonial contexts. Psychiatry in this form becomes less about healing and more about regulating legibility, deciding whose suffering counts, whose recovery is valid, and whose cultural knowledge can be trusted. Working from a decolonised lens requires a different starting point. Instead of asking, what disorder fits this person, the therapist asks, what does this person's suffering mean in the context of their culture, their community, their history, and their story? This shift is not cosmetic, it is transformative. It moves the centre of gravity from pathology to possibility, from diagnosis to dialogue, from expertise to mutual recognition. The decolonised therapist does not claim to fix, but rather to witness, to hold, and to recreate the conditions for meaning to emerge. Listening, however, is not passive. It demands humility and the courage to admit uncertainty. It requires that the therapist release the role of infallible expert and become a companion, present, reflexive, and porous to other ways of knowing. This process of humility is not one of loss, but of liberation. It makes space for something richer, the possibility of truly meeting clients where they are, rather than where the profession expects them to be. Cultural amnesia, trauma, and the legacy of double consciousness. Trauma, in Western psychology, is often framed as an individual rupture, an event that disturbs the integrity of the self. But in many Indigenous, African, Middle Eastern, and diasporic traditions, trauma is seen as communal, intergenerational, and ecological. It is not merely lodged in the brain or body, but carried in family stories, in rituals, in collective silence, and in the land itself. To confine healing to the individual is to misunderstand the very nature of the wound. Colonisation not only dispossessed peoples of land, it dislocated them from their identities. Languages were criminalised, spiritualities demonised, histories erased. The sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, 1903, famously captured this internal fracture as double consciousness, the condition of seeing oneself through the eyes of a society that devalues one's origins. This conflict creates a psychic wound that cannot be traced to a single traumatic event, but to centuries of cultural violence. It is the ache of belonging nowhere, of measuring oneself against imposed ideals of civility, sanity, and worth. For many in formerly colonised communities, this wound manifests as intergenerational trauma, not only psychologically but biologically. Emerging research in epigenetics supports what many cultures have long intuited. Trauma can be inherited, passed down through stress responses encoded in DNA. But while science may now validate these truths, many colonised people have long carried them without recognition. Another legacy of colonial domination is the erosion of trust in traditional systems of healing. When spiritual practices and ancestral medicine are cast as primitive or unscientific, generations are taught to mistrust their own tools. Even when these practices survive colonisation, they are often reclaimed with uncertainty, as if their legitimacy depends on Western approval. This produces a form of cultural self-doubt, a silencing of the very voices that once sustained resilience. Meanwhile, Western psychology begins to appropriate these same practices, mindfulness, ritual, storytelling, without accountability to their origins. In this context, decolonising therapy is not a luxury or a trend. It is a necessity. It is a political, ethical and spiritual act, an act of rehumanisation for both therapist and client. As Du Bois, Fanon and others remind us, liberation is not only structural, it is psychic. And to engage in this work is to begin healing wounds that were never meant to be seen, let alone named. Restoring severed roots, a personal reflection. People who have been cut off from their cultural and ancestral roots may adapt to new places and cultures. They may succeed in life, speak new languages, navigate new systems, even rise within them. But something essential can still be missing, a connection to the past, to the wisdom and resilience of those who came before. Decolonised psychotherapy seeks to restore those severed roots, to offer not only understanding but reconnection, to memory, to community, to a sense of meaning beyond survival. This work is not abstract or theoretical, it is deeply personal. As a psychotherapist whose journey has been shaped by the intersections of culture, religion, identity, trauma, and historically disadvantaged skin colour, I have lived the impacts of colonial legacies. Growing up in a part of the world where empire's fingerprints remain etched into institutions, borders, and daily life, I witnessed how these legacies silence voices, distort self-perception, and create invisible ceilings. I know how they can infiltrate the psyche, forcing one to question their worth and legitimacy. But I have also seen, within myself and others, how these legacies can be named, challenged, and slowly transformed. In this journey, storytelling becomes more than narrative. It becomes medicine. In many cultures, storytelling is how knowledge is passed on, how memory survives when institutions forget, and how identity endures in exile. Stories are not simply words, they are carriers of belonging. They remind us that our wounds are not isolated, and that our lives are linked to those who came before and those who will come after. In a decolonised therapeutic space, stories create bridges between past and present, between individual and collective, between pain and the possibility of healing. But storytelling is not enough. It must be joined with action, with a commitment to restructure the systems that perpetuate disconnection. Decolonisation does not stop at uprooting the weeds of colonialism. It also involves tending to the garden that remains. It means creating an environment where diverse forms of healing can coexist, where no one tradition claims superiority, where CBT and indigenous cosmologies can exist side by side, not as opposites, but as co-conspirators in the work of care. In practical terms, this means developing therapeutic practices that resonate with clients' lived realities. It means designing therapy rooms that reflect the communities they serve, integrating rituals, languages, symbols and values that hold meaning. It means collaborating with elders, cultural leaders and grassroots healers. And it means constantly listening to the wisdom that was once called primitive, to the knowledge that has been waiting to return, and to the people whose voices were buried beneath colonial rubble. One of the many lessons I have learned in this work is that decolonisation is never linear. It is layered, emotional, at times profoundly disorientating. It demands discomfort and it resists shortcuts. I have come to better understand why Fanon said decolonisation is always a violent phenomenon. Not always in the literal sense, but in its disruption of narratives, institutions and comforts. It means standing in the liminal space where histories collide and futures are rewritten. It means holding the personal and the political in the same breath. It means looking at inherited wounds, not to be paralysed by them, but to refuse their invisibility. In my work as a therapist, I have met clients whose struggles with anxiety, low self-worth and fractured identity are not reducible to isolated experiences or chemical imbalances. Their distress often finds its roots in narratives imposed across generations, narratives of inferiority, alienation and erasure, birthed in the colonial project. These narratives did not simply discredit their ancestors' knowledge, they replaced it with emptiness, with a manufactured silence that tells them they are not enough. The task of decolonised psychotherapy is to meet these stories not with diagnosis, but with deep listening and truth-telling, to help individuals remember who they were before they were told to forget. To truly decolonise the mind, we must first recognise that colonialism was not only an act of violence against bodies, it was an act of violence against stories. Edward Said, in his seminal work Culture and Imperialism, 1993, captures this truth when he argues that imperialism constructs cultural narratives that frame the colonised as inferior, incomplete or uncivilised without Western intervention. Said's analysis offers a powerful lens through which to understand the psychology of colonisation. The more pervasive the narrative of inferiority, the more deeply it becomes embedded in the psyche of the colonised. In psychotherapy, these narratives appear in forms that seem mundane, but are profoundly significant. A young woman ashamed of her accent, a man suppressing his grief because he has been taught that vulnerability is weakness, or a child who hides their heritage out of fear of ridicule. Drawing from Said's critique of colonial narrative power, I believe that healing cannot end with deconstruction. It must also involve reconstruction, a deliberate act of creating or reclaiming stories that affirm complexity, dignity and cultural integrity. It is not enough to critique the soil. We must plant something new within it. One client I worked with carried a heavy burden of intergenerational trauma. His family had experienced forced displacement, like many whose lands were seized by colonial powers. He grew up hearing his grandparents' stories that were drenched in suffering, loss and longing. His identity became entangled with their trauma. He felt that he had inherited only pain, but together in the therapy room we looked again. We re-examined the same stories through another lens, the resilience embedded in them, the creativity of rebuilding life in exile, the cultural practices that had survived oceans and silence. Slowly he began to see himself not only as the bearer of trauma, but as the inheritor of strength. As he re-authored these intergenerational narratives, I often thought of Fanon's words. Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Fanon spoke of decolonisation as a revolutionary act, and I agree. To decolonise is to reclaim the right to narrate one's own story. It is to refuse the confines that others have drawn and to choose instead a fuller, richer map of the self. This reclamation is where trauma-informed care becomes vital. When we confront the psychological wounds left by colonialism, racism, cultural erasure, spiritual invalidation, we must begin with safety. Trauma is not only what happened to someone, it is how their nervous system learned to survive in response. Clients navigating the lifelong effects of oppression often carry an understandable mistrust, not just towards others, but toward themselves. They may doubt their own instincts, struggle to believe their pain is real, or feel ashamed of their emotions. because those very things have been dismissed by the world around them. Trauma-informed therapy offers a way back, not just a way back into the therapeutic relationship, but a way back into self-trust. When I began to integrate culturally grounded, trauma-informed practices into my work, I was struck by how many healing traditions from indigenous and non-Western cultures already embodied these principles. Communal rituals, ceremony, embodied movement and storytelling, these practices create safety, recognise the sacredness of emotion, and affirm relational interdependence. These are not new inventions. They are long-held wisdoms that have simply been marginalised by Western clinical dominance. To decolonise psychotherapy is not to supplement Western models with cultural add-ons. It is to honour the epistemologies that preceded them and continue to flourish, often in resistance. Land plays a critical role in this reconnection. For many cultures, the land is not just a physical place, it is memory, identity, spirit, and ancestor. In Arabic, the phrase, "the land is the honour," expresses this sacred bond. Colonialism shattered these relationships, turning sacred landscapes into commodities and their stewards into displaced labour. In therapy, I have seen how returning to the land, even in symbolic or sensory ways, can trigger deep healing. A walk in a forest, planting a seed, placing one's hands in soil. These acts become ceremonies of remembrance. As Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith 2012 writes, "The land remembers what has been forgotten. And in that remembering, we too may find pieces of ourselves that were once lost." But decolonisation is not nostalgia. It is not a return to an imagined past where everything was pure or perfect. It is a weaving of old and new, of rupture and resilience, of grief and growth. It honours complexity rather than erasing it. As therapists, educators, and human beings, our task is not to provide easy answers, but to hold space for difficult truths and to guide others through them with humility and care. Global perspectives on decolonising mental health, theoretical foundations. In examining the impact of colonialism on mental health and the journey of decolonisation, it is impossible to overlook the profound contributions of thinkers from Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. These voices illuminate how colonial systems shape not only political and economic realities, but also individual and collective psyches. Their work offers critical frameworks through which to critique, dismantle, and reimagine psychotherapy, grounding it in a more inclusive and culturally attuned praxis. Paulo Freire's seminal Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1970, reimagines liberation through the lens of critical consciousness, a framework with transformative potential for mental health practice. Freire critiques traditional hierarchies in education, but the same critique applies powerfully to psychotherapy's often Eurocentric models, where therapists assume the role of expert, imposing interpretive frameworks rather than fostering mutual dialogue. This colonial dynamic, embedded in the therapeutic process, reinforces oppression by denying clients the agency to author their own healing. In contrast, Freire's vision, resonant with John MacLeod and Cooper's 2012 pluralistic model, frames therapy as a collaborative, consciousness-raising encounter in which clients name their pain, trace its structural roots, and reclaim their narratives. For those committed to decolonise care, this demands a transformation of psychotherapy from private, individual treatment into a dialogical, politicised, and collective space for empowerment. Similarly, Kenyan writer and academic Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who passed away on the 28th of May 2025 while I was writing this book, in his landmark work Decolonising the Mind, 1986, explores how colonialism weaponised language as a tool of domination and psychological control. Language, for Ngugi, was both a site of trauma and a medium of resistance. The imposition of colonial languages disrupted cultural identity and intergenerational knowledge transmission. In the context of therapy, this insight has profound implications. The dominance of Western psychological discourse often forces clients, particularly those from immigrant and diasporic communities, to describe their experiences in alien terms, stripped of emotional resonance and cultural specificity. For example, a word like sabr in Arabic or hiya in Swahili may carry layers of meaning that English cannot easily capture. Effective decolonised practice requires more than linguistic translation. It demands epistemic translation, where the client's worldview is honoured as valid, whole and central. Therapists must embrace linguistic diversity as an ethical and clinical imperative, not a symbolic gesture. From a Pan-African perspective, Frantz Fanon's work as a psychiatrist and revolutionary offers an unflinching critique of colonialism's psychological violence. His concept of the colonised mind reveals how domination becomes internalised, a theft not only of land but of the self. In Fanon's analysis, colonisation breeds what Bulhan, 1985, termed metacolonial alienation, the dislocation of identity, community and spiritual meaning. Western psychotherapy, built on individualistic and biomedical assumptions, is often ill-equipped to address such collective and intergenerational wounds. What Fanon documented in Algeria finds its counterpart in indigenous African frameworks, particularly Ubuntu-informed therapy, which posits that healing must occur in relationship, not isolation. These traditions are not nostalgic remnants, they are active, living systems of knowledge that mend the ruptures created by colonial trauma. They remind us that healing is not an internal event alone. It is relational, communal, and ecological. Latin American thinkers have also shaped the intellectual architectures of decolonised mental health. Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, 1971, renders the continent as a wounded body, scarred by extraction yet pulsing with regenerative vitality. This metaphor extends to the therapeutic space, where clients carry histories of colonisation not only as pain but as potential. Narrative therapy, as pioneered by White and Epstein, 1990, aligns with Galeano's ethos by encouraging clients to reauthor their stories, transforming their scars from sites of shame to evidence of survival and strength. But Galeano's metaphor of the wounded continent finds its political complement in the work of Afro-Brazilian philosopher Abdias do Nascimento. His philosophy of quilombismo, inspired by the autonomous black communities that resisted enslavement, insists that true healing is collective. In this vision, therapy becomes a space not only for personal transformation, but for rebuilding communal sanctuaries, what Kiermaier et al. 2014 call communities of resilience. Together, these thinkers offer a powerful challenge to conventional Western psychotherapy. They remind us that colonisation was never just an event of the past. It is a living structure that continues to shape our institutions, our knowledge systems, and our healing practices. To decolonize psychotherapy, then, is not to add cultural elements to an otherwise Western framework. It is to fundamentally reconsider what healing means, who defines it, and whose wisdom we honour in the process. Colonial narratives, structural violence, and indigenous epistemologies. Edward Said's Orientalism, 1978, and Arundhati Roy's Critique of Neoliberal Globalism, The Cost of Living, 1999, together illuminate both the psychological and structural dimensions of colonial violence. Said's framework unveils how Orientalist narratives construct the colonised as perpetually other, producing what David, 2014, identifies as internalised epistemicide. The internal rejection of ancestral knowledge in favour of westernised performance. In therapy, this manifests when clients dismissed indigenous cosmologies as backward or struggle to articulate themselves in languages that fail to capture their emotional and cultural depth. Roy's analysis extends this critique to the economic terrain, showing how extractive capitalism enacts ongoing colonisation through forced displacement, land dispossession, and the criminalisation of resistance. Her documentation of Adivasi communities in India, pathologised for grieving their expulsion due to dam construction, exemplifies how colonialism repackages its violence as development, and how psychiatry can be complicit in this erasure. Together, these perspectives reorient the therapeutic task. A Dalit client's depression cannot be decontextualised from caste-based violence. A Palestinian's trauma must be understood within the reality of continued occupation. Where Said guides therapists in identifying internalized oppression, Roy demands they confront its structural underpinnings. The result is a shift from conventional therapy to solidarity-based care, a praxis of radical witnessing, resistance validation, and community-grounded healing. Such care might include facilitating community storytelling, documenting state violence for legal advocacy, or validating grief that has been pathologized by state-sanctioned systems of removal. Roy's assertion that the private is public and the public is private aptly captures the essence of this decolonial approach. There is no neat division between inner pain and political context. The therapist becomes not only clinician, but ally and co-struggler, attuned to how power operates within the therapeutic space and the social order alike. From Southeast Asia, the writings of Filipino nationalist and revolutionary Jose Rizal offer a transformative framework for decolonising mental health. His work, El Filibusterismo, 1891, Noli Me Tangere, 1887, reveals how cultural erasure produces psychic rupture and calls for healing rooted in cultural reconnection. Rizal's legacy lives on Psicología Filipino psychology, developed by Virgilio Enriquez, 1994, which centres indigenous values as Kapwa, shared identity, and Pakiki Pag Kapwa Tau, interpersonal connectedness. These principles reject Western individualism and instead affirm relational being as central to psychological well-being. A compelling example of this is seen in Pepua's 2015 work with overseas Filipino workers. Many overseas Filipino workers suffer from kaba, a culturally infected form of anxiety associated with dislocation, longing, and diasporic responsibility. Western frameworks often mislabel this as generalized anxiety disorder, erasing its cultural roots. A Rizal-informed intervention would instead 1. Reframe haya, cultural shame, as a legacy of colonial inferiority, not a personal failing. 2. Integrate kwentuhan, community storytelling, as both therapeutic practice and cultural reclamation. 3. Incorporate oracion, spiritual healing practices, as culturally grounded tools for trauma processing and restoration. Here, therapy becomes an act of turn to self, culture, and collective memory. As Rizal described, it is a light emerging from darkness. It is through this lens that suffering is not individualized, but seen as part of a historical tapestry of survival, endurance, and resistance. What unites Said, Roy, Rizal, and the other thinkers in this tradition is their insistence that the personal is inherently political. Mental health cannot be abstracted from caste, race, displacement, language loss, or militarized borders. Decolonisation, then, is not a theoretical gesture. It is a lived commitment to challenge what is assumed to be universal, to honour what has been dismissed, and to reimagine healing on pluralistic, relational terms. This radically repositions our understanding of trauma. Trauma is not merely an individual disorder to be managed. It is a relational, intergenerational, and structural phenomenon, one shaped by legacies of colonialism and sustained by systems of exclusion and marginalisation. Decolonising mental health requires more than critique. It calls for praxis, ongoing, embodied, and culturally located work that centres the voices silenced by imperial knowledge systems. As Frere 1970 reminds us, liberation is never solitary. Healing must be done collectively. It must reconcile colonial fracture without romanticising pre-colonial idealism, weaving futures that are grounded in dignity and justice. The thinkers in this section leave us with a challenge and an invitation. As clinicians, scholars, and community members, we must 1. Hold duality, critiquing oppressive systems while cultivating flexible, pluralistic practices. 2. Centre marginalised epistemologies, not as add-ons to the Western canon, but as equally valid systems of knowing. 3. Embrace healing as spiral, not linear, acknowledging that reconnection, like resistance, is cyclical, layered, and non-linear. The next chapter, Trauma and the Colonised Mind, traces how these fractures manifest intergenerationally, from silenced languages to displaced bodies, and how reconnection becomes resistance.